Hello everyone. Today's video is about gender and race in the 1920s. It's a deep dive. I do provide a broad overview lecture in a video I just recorded, so I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Also, I just want to give you the heads up. I'm recording in the evening and all three of my cats are awake and they're making a lot of noise, so forgive me if there's background noise. And here is the corresponding reading to this lecture, and I will also leave a link to that chapter in the description below. And I do also want to provide a language disclaimer. I do not use this word out loud in my classes anymore. However, I will be using this word out loud in this video. So this word, Negro, is derived from the word for black in Romance languages. And it very much is a derogatory term today. It is a slur. It is like a soft N-word. In the Progressive era and in the 1920s, this word was much more commonly used. In fact, the capitalization of the N was seen as a sign of respect. It was something that Black activists such as Carter G. Woodson advocated for. And in many ways, it's reminiscent of the capitalization of the letter B in Black among supporters of Black Lives Matter. And this is a very helpful article if you want to learn more. I'll leave a link to it in the cards. Let's just quickly pause if you would like to write down the guiding questions for the day. So let's start by talking about gender and sexuality in the 1920s, and we'll start with women. So after the ratification of the 18th and 19th Amendments, which were prohibition and the women's suffrage amendment, respectively, there was no longer really a sense of cohesion among female activists. In many ways, they saw these two amendments as the crowning achievement of what they were striving for in the Progressive era. But nonetheless, there was an Equal Rights Amendment that was introduced in the early 1920s that ultimately stalled and still to this day has not been ratified. So because of that, there is still very much this distinction between the sexes. There is very much a stressing that women were still meant to be wives and mothers, but still we very much see some signs of change that are worth getting into. So first, let's discuss the flapper. The flapper was very much seen as a sign of female liberation. In terms of both image and behavior, they were seen as more masculine. They cut their hair shorter, they wore less restrictive clothing, the hemlines went up, the waistlines were looser, and that allowed for more freedom of movement to dance. And women also would attend speakeasies. Those were underground bars during the Prohibition era. They also would take up smoking cigarettes, and flappers were more likely to engage in premarital sexual activity. And these new behaviors were encouraged by increased consumerism from the 1920s. So the growing availability and affordability of cars, for example, again allowed for more freedom of movement to go out. And it also allowed for more sexual freedom because owning a car meant that many Americans had their first sexual experiences in the back seat of a car. Household appliances also allowed for much more freedom, especially because it cut the amount of time that it would take to do something like clean your house in half, and that would allow you to go out. And also, if you were working outside the home, you were more likely to have a disposable income. So that led to the growing advertisements that were targeted towards women in the fashion and cosmetics industry. And you do, again, still see this as the exception. In general, women were still expected to be maternal. Most flappers were unmarried and young, and only about 10% of married American women worked outside the home in the 1920s. Women who did work outside the home were typically still in traditionally feminine professions such as nursing or teaching or clerical work. Other professions such as practicing law or medicine were almost exclusively still relegated to men. Women's experiences differed dramatically based on race and socioeconomic status. So most women who worked outside the home did it for financial necessity. In the South, Jim Crow segregation, and in the North, Northwest, and the West, de facto segregation made it so that Black women were often relegated to low-paying domestic jobs such as housekeeping and nanny work. Older married white women were typically less likely to work outside the home. In terms of the LGBTQ community, there was growing visibility in the 1920s, particularly in large cities like New York. It's important, of course, to mention here that same-sex couples and non-binary forms of gender expression were by no means new in the 1920s. They just became more open in urban areas. The vaudeville music scene and the theater scene became a hub for the LGBTQ community. Gay men were able to live more openly in these areas, well, less so later in the decade because Red Scare sentiments, as they arose, there was increased criticism of any culture that went against the mainstream, and homosexuality was seen as non-conforming and therefore potentially intertwined with communism. That said, since sexuality became more visible, there was increased scrutiny also of same-sex relationships. Women frequently in the 19th century, if they had a female partner, they would live as lifelong companions, and many people would not bat an eye at that. But again, because there was a more vibrant lesbian community, there was more skepticism there. And I would argue that it was a little bit more difficult for lesbians to live openly in the United States. There was a much more vibrant lesbian community in Europe, specifically in Paris. And just really quickly, we went over these in my class, but if you're not my students, these are really interesting videos. So this video from the photo booth, it's interesting to think about how technological innovation allows for this sense of privacy in this very intimate moment. And this also, again, I just mentioned the fact that some lesbians in the United States felt that they couldn't live necessarily as openly as gay men could, and some of them ended up actually relocating to European cities that were more accepting of lesbian lifestyles. And I think that it's really important to just briefly mention Mabel Hampton because she very much was a pioneer in the LGBTQ history books because she was one of the first out Black lesbian American women that I can recall. If I think of any others, I will leave some ideas in the comments, or rather in the description, and do feel free, if you know more, leave a comment for me. I'd love to hear more. I'm always loving to learn. Also, as far as gender non-conforming expression, there was a pretty vibrant drag scene also in New York and other major cities as well. And so Julian Eltinge was a very famous drag queen at the time, although was not a trans woman. Julian was male. And Julian also married a woman. And Julian, it's worth mentioning, was very wealthy independently and was white. And so it was much easier for him to live his life as a drag queen than it would have been for a woman of color or a woman that did not have the same sort of financial means. So let's move on to African Americans in the 1920s. First, by discussing the Great Migration. So the Great Migration had two waves, and the first one took place during and after World War I. So between about 1910 and 1930, you're really starting to see this movement begin. And what this was a migration of African Americans outside of the Jim Crow South and into northern, Midwestern, and Western locations, typically in large cities where there was more of an opportunity to get a higher paying job. And these cities were also a destination for Black immigrants coming from abroad. And I do want us to zero in on Harlem, New York City, which had a population of about 164,000 people. Most of them were Black, and it was nicknamed the greatest Negro city of the world at the time. It was a hotbed of cultural and intellectual activity, better known as the Harlem Renaissance, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. This was also a time when the New Negro moment was championed in Black academia. It rejected the assumption that Black Americans were inferior to white Americans. And I should be broader than that. This was very much a global effort as well, a Pan-African effort. We talked about this when we studied W.E.B. Du Bois during the Progressive Era. The New Negro movement celebrated Black contributions to society in terms of literature, and there was an emergence of popular authors such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. And their work typically addressed themes of racism and racial stereotypes in the United States. The Harlem Renaissance, it was a celebration of Black culture, largely stemming from the Harlem district in New York. Although the cultural movement itself was by no means limited to New York. It's just that particular neighborhood in New York City, in many ways, epitomized this era. And so in Harlem specifically, you see this flourishing of a nightclub scene, a theater scene. I think one of the best known sites, if you ever want to do any sightseeing in Harlem, would be the Apollo Theater. What's interesting about this theater was it was originally only open to white patrons, and that was before it was called the Apollo. It briefly closed and then reopened in the mid 1930s under the name the Apollo Theater. But before it integrated, it still featured many Black performers. But it also demonstrated one of the complexities of the Harlem Renaissance. So the audience at this theater was white, but the performers were Black frequently. And even though they were in the same public space, the performers often had to enter the facilities through separate entrances. They were often restricted to separate bathrooms. And so this is an example of a more modern term called Blaxploitation. This idea that there was an embracing of Black culture, but at the same time, it's still sort of exploitative and also still segregated. And in terms of music, recording labels often made fortunes off of artists like Ma Rainey or Bessie Smith, but did not compensate them accordingly. And Ma Rainey, who I mentioned, I had a video in the previous video, rather, I had a song linked in the previous video, when she was interviewed later in life, when she was talking about the white record producers she worked for, she said, quote, "They don't care nothing about me. All they want is my voice," end quote. So I think that really encapsulates that sense of Blaxploitation. As far as Black politics are concerned, I want to dive in a little bit to Garveyism. So what you're seeing in the 1920s is an evolution of new Black political movements like Pan-Africanism, although of course W.E.B. Du Bois also embraced that in the early 1900s, the 1900s, the 19 teens. And Pan-Africanism was an international movement towards Black nationalism, self-determination, and also equal rights. And this was very much a global movement. And this was epitomized in the 1920s with Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican-born author and labor activist who moved to New York City in the middle of World War I. And Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and his efforts were similar to Du Bois in some regard in terms of the promotion of racial pride, but different in the sense that it rejected Du Bois's approach towards education as elitist and unattainable. Rather, I should clarify, Garvey said that that was elitist and unattainable. That was what Du Bois strove for. Instead, Garvey embraced some of Booker T. Washington's ideas, such as industrial education and Black self-sufficiency. And there was also less emphasis on progress through the legal system, like with the NAACP. Some Garveyists, and including, of course, Garvey himself, supported the Return to Africa movement, which promoted Black Americans to move to Africa, mostly to Liberia, to develop political independence from whites. And typically, Garveyism supported a more economic rather than political approach towards racial uplift. So it's interesting because it combines elements of both W.E.B. Du Bois's goals and also Booker T. Washington's goals. So that will wrap it up for today. Here are the guiding questions again, so maybe pause and see. Hopefully this video helped clarify some of these concepts, and we'll pick back up. We still have a little bit of the 1920s to finish up. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.